Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I know we still have some colleagues joining us, so we'll let them, come in as and when. But I think it's good to be punctual and make a start. And just want to start by just saying it's lovely to welcome you all to this webinar this afternoon, which is the next edition of our teacher-focused webinar series entitled Teaching Critical Thinking in Practice, a discussion on how higher order thinking skills can be taught effectively in the classroom. Just start with a quick introduction. My name's Aziz. I'm head of school partnerships here at the Brilliant Club. And I want to start by saying obviously a huge thank you to all of those who are able to join us today on what I'm sure is a very busy week, particularly in the run up to Christmas. And I know we have colleagues joining from right the way across the country and from a variety of different backgrounds and contexts as well. So it's been lovely to see a few of you already introducing yourself in the chat. If you haven't already done so, please do say hello. Let us know where you're joining from. And I'm just going to quickly run through some kind of general housekeeping rules and a short introduction before passing over to my colleague, Lauren. Thanks. So yeah, just to let you know, this meeting is being recorded solely for the purpose of sharing with yourselves and any attendees who weren't able to make this session. Please don't let that hinder your confidence in sharing any thoughts or kind of reflections as we move through. We'd love to hear from you throughout. And as I mentioned, you can do that using the chat function. Hopefully you should have access to that. There might also be opportunities to bring you in and ask you to unmute your mics and share your kind of thoughts with us later on. However, please do keep microphones muted as standard. If possible, please do update your name on Zoom. This helps us accurately kind of record who you are and also kind of track attendance and follow up with any kind of relevant resources with yourselves after the event. And there will be time for questions and discussion at the end. We will endeavour to respond to any kind of comments and thoughts that do come up in the chat throughout. So please do utilise that function and we will try and address these accordingly when we have time. So yeah, it'd be lovely to hear from you in the chat if you get a moment. But just before I do pass over to my colleague Lauren, I wanted to provide some context about us, the Brilliant Club, and the work that we do as a charity across the UK, working with over 800 schools to support less advantaged pupils to access the most competitive universities and ultimately succeed when they get there. Why is this our mission? It's for the well-established fact, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, that those from the most advantaged backgrounds access competitive universities at a much greater rate compared to their least advantaged peers. Specifically, 1 in 3 of the most advantaged compared to just 3 in 100 of the least advantaged. And we ultimately want to rebalance these figures, which is what our kind of suite of programs are designed to do. I'm just going to touch on a few of those now. Specifically, some of you that are representing schools or from a school background today will be aware of our flagship Scholars Programme. We've been running that for over a decade now, and that's ultimately aimed at providing pupils with university learning experiences. And we're aiming to support 100,000 less advantaged students to access competitive universities as part of our latest 5-year strategy. We've also recently launched Make Your Mark, focused on kind of boosting attainment through subject-specific curriculum training, very much building on the work that we've done as part of the NTP through our brilliant tutoring program over the last few years. Another arm of our work is looking at our parent power programs, and that's really about supporting parents and carers to address the barriers to education in their local community. So really trying to adopt a holistic approach to supporting those less advantaged pupils into higher education. And finally, just to briefly mention Join the Dots, a relatively recent program launched that looks at supporting supporting pupils in the transition from school to university, and through shared connections between schools, universities, and mentors. And that's really to ensure that there's less advantaged pupils, once they reach university, are having really positive experience and are achieving kind of the same outcomes as their more advantaged peers. If you would like to find out more about any of these programs, please do reach out to me directly. I'll be sharing my contact details with you all following this webinar, and I'd be happy to discuss those in more detail. Wonderful. Well, what I'd like to do now is pass over to my colleague, Dr. Lauren Bellaera. I'm very happy to be in our office today sharing a space with her, which is a rare treat. And she'll be leading you through the rest of the webinar on teaching critical thinking in practice. Just to briefly introduce Lauren, Lauren is Chief Impact and Strategy Officer here at the Brilliant Club. Alongside this role, and generally being a wonderful human being, Lauren is also a lecturer at the Institute of Education, UCL, where she teaches applied research methods and supervises master's dissertations in psychology and education. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Lauren.
And thank you very much for joining our webinar this afternoon. And we will be talking about all things critical thinking. And as Aziz says, we've got some questions, interactive pieces as we go through, and then there will also be an opportunity for further questions and discussion at the end. But as always, do feel free to pop things into the chat as we go. Okay, so what we're going to cover in the webinar is firstly thinking about what is critical thinking, because it's a very broad concept, and then thinking about in the context of education why it really matters, and then importantly thinking about the ways in which we can teach critical thinking effectively, and really thinking about that practical application to the classroom. And then what I will do is I will touch very briefly upon the Brilliant Club's approach to teaching critical thinking, and then we will talk about it in the context of our widening access programs. And then, as I said, there will be an opportunity for further discussion and questions at the end. Okay, so what is critical thinking and why does it matter? So to begin with, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. And so why are you interested in critical thinking? And in particular, why do you think it's important to teach critical thinking to students? And so I'll just invite people to add their comments into the chat function, and we would just pause for a few moments to see people's reflections. Fantastic stuff. I'm nodding in smiling very much this, and all of this stuff is very much in lines with my interest in why I think critical thinking is important as well. So we'll just give it another 30 seconds and then we will move on. Okay, so this is really interesting. I think we're already seeing a whole host of things coming through. So some reference to it being very subject specific, and so thinking about things like philosophy, for example, and then also thinking more broadly about really making sure students are equipped in terms of their evaluation and analysis skills, which again, we will come on to, we will talk about in a little bit more detail later on. Okay, so I'm just going to move us on. Okay, so this is really thinking about critical thinking through the student life cycle and thinking about it across school, university, and into employment. And so we know from research that critical thinking is really very important across all stages and ages of education. And when we think about it in a school context, we as educators and we as teachers there's a lot of emphasis on the importance of teaching critical thinking practically in the classroom. And we see this from different sources of research across different countries. And so the recognition from a teacher perspective, which is a particularly important one, is that critical thinking is really significant. And we need to be practically teaching it in the classroom from a young age. And then when we think about university, often critical thinking is sort of described as the outcome of higher education. And so often what we do is we see it as at a strategic level within the university, critical thinking is often cited. And so really that is seen as a really core purpose of university and for the students that are participating in higher education. And then the other connection through the kind of longer term connection is really in and around employment. And so we know in that context, critical thinking is again, really, really important. And so often what we see from employers, both within in a US context, but also in a UK context as well, is that there's a little bit of a gap. And so university graduates that are coming through into particular types of employment and jobs, often there's expressions from employers that there's a little bit of a gap in terms of critical thinking skills and critical thinking abilities. And so really we know as an educational ecosystem as a whole, but also with that bridging in connection to employment, that it is everybody's responsibility to be driving forward and developing critical thinking. And then just to sort of talk through and really unpick this definition of critical thinking a bit more, because it's, as I said at the beginning, is definitely a multifaceted definition and quite a complex definition. And so when we talk about critical thinking broadly, we talk about it in two different ways. And so we talk about critical thinking in terms of critical thinking skills, and then we talk about critical thinking in terms of critical thinking and dispositions. And this has a really strong evidence base that there are these, in terms of critical thinking, there are these two very, very distinct concepts and components. And so when we think about critical thinking skills, we're really thinking about a very specific set of cognitive skills. And so things like analysis and evaluation, and there's other things that people were drawing upon in chat. And then we also have dispositions which are slightly more attitudinal and more linked to individuals' personalities. But this is really about individuals' habits of mind and habits of thinking. And so it can be things around people's level of critical openness, or to do with curiosity. And so we know we have these two different components. And ideally, within all individuals, we'd have the dispositional aspect, and then we'd also have the critical thinking skills aspect. And then the other thing to say in terms of the way in which you teach critical thinking, which we will come on to and talk about in more detail. Often when we talk about critical thinking skills, so there are two things we can do. We can teach it at a subject-specific level, or we can teach it at a general level. Often, in terms of the best outcomes for critical thinking, the best thing to do is to teach it within a specific subject and to really embed it and to integrate it. And then we know for critical thinking dispositions, this, as I said, is a much broader set. And so this is more of a general approach. And so what we're going to do today is primarily we're going to focus on critical thinking skills. And we're going to talk about it at a subject-specific level and also a general level. And then the other thing to say is that if we're thinking about the development of critical thinking, developing critical thinking skills relatively is easier than developing critical thinking dispositions. And so that isn't to say that developing critical thinking skills is easy, but what the research shows is that dispositions by their very nature are more fixed and therefore are more difficult to shift. And then I just wanted to sort of really draw attention to a slightly broader set of words that link to critical thinking. And so often when we talk about critical thinking, we also talk about things such as metacognition. We talk about creativity. We talk about self-regulation, problem solving, and higher order thinking. And often there's a question of, well, what's the connection between them? And the honest answer is that ultimately all of these things are interrelated, and all of these things overlap. So when I'm talking about critical thinking today, I'll be drawing upon very explicitly these different components. And another thing to point out is that sometimes when we talk about creativity and problem solving, from a research literature perspective, that is sometimes talked about separately from critical thinking. And in other instances, it's talked about as an example of critical thinking skills within critical thinking. And so what I will be doing is I'll be using the latter approach. And so bringing together creativity and problem solving under the umbrella of critical thinking. Okay, and I want to sort of get straight into some really concrete definitions of critical thinking skills, because I think one of the difficulties of teaching critical thinking is that potentially, in what we've seen so far, is it can be quite a broad concept. And so being really intentional about what skills we're talking about. And so these are a set of critical thinking skills. There are 10 in total. And we've taken the definitions from the research literature. And I think broadly, we could talk around all day about definitions and tweaking bits of it. But really, this is about each of these definitions really representing the essence of each of these critical thinking skills. And so what we did to, kind of when I say we, this was a research project I did a couple of years ago as part of the Fulbright Scholarship. I was involved in this as part of a research team. And so we went through the research literature and we looked at all of the differences and similarities between different definitions. And then we pulled out what we refer to as the consensus definitions. And so these particular skills in the definitions are really embodying what we mean when we talk about analysis, for example, or what we mean when we talk about creativity. And I think this is really important, because if we're going to teach critical thinking effectively, then the first thing we need to do is to know what are the particular skills and what does that cover and what does that relate to. Okay, so we're going to do our first poll of the webinar. And sort of mindful that lots of people on the call are teachers, which is fantastic. But we also have some people from universities and also slightly broader areas of education. And so we're asking the question, what are the key critical thinking skills in your subject, if you're a teacher? And then if you're working in a different part of the education system, what are the most important critical thinking skills in your area? And I'm going to hand over to Aziz to do a poll. So we'll have a little look at the poll. And so hopefully everybody can see those results coming through. And so interestingly, we see analysis is ranked as a critical thinking skill that people think are particularly important. And then you can see the kind of pattern through. So evaluation and also explanation is also highlighted as important. And I'm gonna pause there on the poll, and then we will come back to discussing that a little bit later on. Okay. Okay, so thinking about this question in the context of higher education, this was this particular research project that I undertook. And so we asked the question to university lecturers, both in the UK, but also in the US, about the critical thinking skills that they thought were most important in higher education. And so what we did was we gave the set of 10 skills with the associated definitions. And then we asked university lecturers to prioritise the importance of these skills, from most important being number 1 to least important being number 10. And so this is similar to what we asked you to do, but slightly different in terms of you weren't ranking from 1 to 10, you were clicking on all of the critical thinking skills that you thought were important. But really the kind of concept and approach beneath is very similar. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to talk about the findings. So we in the sample, we had 176 faculty staff from 46 institutions. And so this was institutions in the UK, but also in the US as well. And then we looked at this across a range of subjects. And so primarily we focused on humanities and social sciences. And then this just gives you the breakdown. So the split between the US and UK for each of those subjects. And then looking at the results in terms of the percentage of number 1 rankings and number 10 rankings. And so interestingly, we see a really, really strong pattern. And actually not that dissimilar to also what we saw coming into the poll a few moments ago. And so from the results, we know that analysis, evaluation, and interpretation are ranked as most important. And so this is statistically significant. And so they are relative to the other skills are more important. And then we see that skills such as problem solving, description, and deductive reasoning are ranked as least important. And so I should also say that we, sort of in addition to pointing out some of those critical thinking skills, we intentionally also included things such as description and explanation, sort of as a set of related skills to critical thinking, but more linked to that kind of factual knowledge and understanding. And so we were interested to see the position of those 2 skills in particular, sort of relative to the critical thinking skills. Okay, so the next logical question which follows from that is, well, what about school teachers? And so what would be a sensible prioritization in a school context? And again, really mindful that we have a lot of schools and a lot of school teachers on the webinar. Okay, so this is kind of sort of an initial and emerging findings. And so we know that in terms of schools, regularly analysis and evaluation are identified as skills that are important. This is primarily through qualitative data. And so studies that have interviewed school teachers, for example, in this isn't just in a UK context, but also in an international context as well. And then we also know, emerging from the data, so this is more the quantitative data, that this pattern also seems to hold. And so more recently, as part of a master's project I was supervising, we did exactly the same thing in terms of the prioritization of those 10 critical thinking skills. And we looked at it in the context of teachers teaching in China. And again, in terms of the significance, we see that analysis and evaluation is ranked very, very highly. And this was across a range of subjects. And so really what we're seeing is emerging evidence that, and I think it's really interesting, but also really helpful, that actually we're starting to visually see this consistency across critical thinking skills across that education journey. But we also know, depending on the subject, there could be a bit of flexibility and variability. And so we would never suggest a blanket approach, but I think it's helpful to know that we are getting that commonality in terms of those critical thinking skills coming up. Okay, so how do you teach critical thinking in practice, which I'm sure many people are on the call for. And so I'm going to run through some different layers of this and point out to you different different pieces of research which I think are particularly informative in this area. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do was very concretely and very explicitly draw up the distinction between theory and practice. I think for critical thinking, this is particularly important. So we know from, if you think about research and when we think about what's going on in the research evidence, often when we talk about critical thinking, we are talking about it from a conceptual or a theoretical perspective. We are talking about, and sometimes even fixating on definitions and the kind of the nuances within that. And then we spend quite a lot of time talking about measurement. And so the way in which you can measure critical thinking effectively. And then the other thing to say here is that often the empirical evidence we do have is more connected to university students as opposed to school students. And so we know, in terms of thinking about the school context, there's a little bit of kind of fuzzy matching between the two. Because actually, we think about the practical application in the information put in the ping box. We know that sometimes taking what we see in the research literature and applying it to the classroom is really difficult and really can be a challenge, because often what the research will suggest is very general, broad brush approaches. And often that stems from particular research not done with the target population. And so really what I hope to do in the remainder of the webinar is really to share with you some really concrete and practical things that you can think about in your own teaching. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just to talk about like the approaches and the pedagogy, because that will ultimately feed into what you do in terms of your activities and the different techniques you're using. And so one thing we do know very, very strongly from the research evidence is that if you want to improve critical thinking, then you need to explicitly teach it. And I feel like this is a really obvious thing to say to a group of teachers, and you absolutely know better than me the importance of explicitly teaching things that you want your students to develop and to learn. I think the interesting thing within the context of teaching critical thinking is that really what the evidence is showing is that you want to take an infusion approach. And so you want to teach critical thinking from a general perspective, as in you want to talk through, for example, the principles of critical thinking. You want to be very explicit in that context. And then you also want to make sure that you're really interweaving it into the subject. And sort of in terms of the split, because this is also something which comes up in terms of, and we will talk about this later on as well, like do you start with the knowledge or do you start with critical thinking? And really what educators, what we should be doing is doing about a 50-50 split between the knowledge and between critical thinking, and practically interweaving those things together. And so thinking about what that might look like in practice, that could begin with a general opening introduction to critical thinking as a concept. And we will also make sure we circulate the slides afterwards, but I've linked to a critical thinking video, which is something, a resource, something that I put together a number of years ago now, I think back in 2016. And so this is when I was conducting a research project in critical thinking at the University of Cambridge, and we were working with a critical thinking company, and so an educational company developing critical thinking resources. And as part of this research project, as well as collecting some empirical data, we also put together some resources. And so this is a very short video we put together on critical thinking that you might find useful for your students. And then the other thing is really top entailing your lessons and your activities with being very explicit about critical thinking learning objectives. And again, really drawing upon those critical thinking skills that we spoke about earlier, and being very intentional if you're focusing on analysis and evaluation, really interweaving that. And then also using those reflection activities as well. Okay, so thinking about some signature pedagogies. And so this I definitely can't take credit for this. This is from a report which was published in 2019 by the OECD. This is looking at critical thinking and creativity in school context. And so what we will do as part of sending around the slides, we will also send around resources and links. And this is a 360-page report. I pulled out some things that I think will be particularly relevant, hopefully, for you as teachers. But there's lots of stuff in here, and it's really very interesting and also very, very progressive. And so this is kind of the pedagogy, the parameters, the framing from which your critical thinking activities and techniques are going to operate. And so there's a lot of discussion around design thinking pedagogy. And so this, often when people think about design thinking, they think about it in a tech context. But we're also able to apply it to an education context. And so this often really just stems from thinking about problem solving. And so I'm really kind of building and layering things up for people and sort of working in a very iterative way and thinking about the application of that in the classroom. And so it's not about getting to the right answer or an answer really quickly, but it's about really working through that process. And then linked to that is around dialogic teaching. And so that could obviously be classroom teaching in terms of teacher to the whole class. It could be a one-to-one, or it could be in smaller groups, teacher-led or student-led. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we talk about some concrete activities and techniques. And then the other thing, and again, bringing in the fact that when we talk about critical thinking, we're also talking about all of these other things which are connected as well. And so metacognition is a big thing, and really building in reflection. And again, often we're using metacognition in practice when we're doing things like problem solving, for example. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and put myself on mute momentarily, and we will do the next poll, and then we're going to move through to talk about the strategies. Just to give a bit of context, so this isn't sort of particularly in relation to critical thinking. This is just thinking about, like, in your teaching practice, do you use these study strategies? And so it could be in relation into not sort of teaching knowledge, or it could be in relation to critical thinking. So this isn't a critical thinking specific question. It's a broader question about your teaching practice, and then we will use that to connect through to the next section. I mean, this is interesting, and I feel like we could talk about this for the rest of the webinar. But I think if anybody's got any kind of immediate reflections in terms of, is this what you expected to see in terms of those percentages, then do feel free to pop that into the chat. But I think the things around retrieval practice and space practice I'm going to talk about momentarily. So we will move on. Okay, so this, and so the reason really I asked more broadly about what study strategies you're using for knowledge, sort of, knowledge critical thinking, just broadly, what are you using within teaching, is because there's a really interesting conversation / debate about whether the study strategies you would use to improve someone's factual knowledge and understanding, you are also able to use critical thinking. And I suppose taking the approach that critical thinking, as we've seen, covers an array of critical thinking skills. And so we also need to be really clear about, when we're talking about the application of these study strategies to critical thinking, actually, what skills do they refer to? And so what I'm going to do is talk through very briefly 2 recent studies. And again, when we send around the follow-up, I will also link to these 2 papers, because they are particularly interesting and I think relevant. And so this is about the effect of space practice. And so whether everything is we talk about spaced versus mass learning, and so whether everything is clustered together, or whether you're spacing it out over a period of time. And so, for example, if you had everything was grouped together under mass learning, you might do something for 3 consecutive days. Whereas if you were spacing it out, then you would do you'd have to do 1 day, 1 week, 1 day the following week, and 1 day the week after. And so this is what they were doing within this particular study. And excitingly, they did this with school children. And so there's definitely relevance in terms of thinking about teaching in a school context. And in terms of the critical thinking skills, they were looking at evaluation. And so again, a very relevant skill that we know is of interest to lots of people. And so this was the original study, the study done in 2019, shows that there is an impact of space practice on critical thinking. And then after a period of time, you give students novel websites to evaluate, they are able to do that better if they had space learning than if they had that mass learning. But interestingly, and I've only recently come across this because it's only recently been published, they tried to do a replication study, and they wanted it to be more of a natural experiment. And so they gave the instructions to teachers, and then it was just incorporated into teaching. And so there were 2 groups. So one group would do the mass learning, and so within 1 week they would cover those topics. And then another group did the space learning, and they did it over 3 weeks. And then a month later, both groups were tested on the evaluation of these novel websites. Interestingly, in this study, they didn't find an effect of spacing on critical thinking. And this was sort of really flagged for potentially 2 reasons. So the study wasn't as well controlled because intentionally it was more of a natural experiment. And then also a lot of the teaching of this was done, as I'm sure people can appreciate, in an online context. And so the issues in and around engagement potentially was an issue. And so really this really to say that this is definitely emerging evidence. We don't know fully the impact of space learning on critical thinking. But this is also something I think from a practitioner perspective, that it's really important to test and to try things. And also given the difference between results in terms of when you do it in a more controlled lab setting versus when you're doing it in a school setting. And so I will leave you to reflect on that, and we can pick up in the discussion if that would be helpful. Okay, so thinking about retrieval practice, which is another study strategy which people talk about a lot. They talk about it a lot in the context of knowledge retention. We will know less of the effects on critical thinking, and sort of often, and again, I think the question is, well, what do you mean when you talk about retrieval practice and critical thinking? What are the critical thinking skills? And so in this context, we're talking about application, analysis, evaluation, and creation. And this study again was done with school students as well as university students, so we can be more confident about the application to school context. And interestingly, my buzzword of this webinar is that, so we see that if you want to improve higher order thinking, then that is what you need to be teaching. And so it's sort of we're connecting it through and thinking about Bloom's taxonomy, which is regularly it's regularly cited in the research literature. It's not about following this structure order of teaching all the knowledge and then teaching critical thinking. And so whatever you want the students to get better at, you just need to be really explicit. And so really the question that stems from that is really about what activities should be used. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to the next couple of slides, and then we will bring the poll up. Okay, so these are the different types of activities you can use to improve critical thinking. And unsurprisingly, I'm sure very, very familiar to everybody on the call, because we don't have like a discrete set of activities that you'd use for critical thinking and then you'd use for knowledge. Ultimately, it's just about the application in the tweaking within a critical thinking context. And so just to be really really explicit and to give some concrete examples here. So this, and again, this is taken from the OECD report, the 2019 report that I mentioned earlier. And so these are examples of, so within these categories of activities, these are particular techniques which you can use. And a lot of it really is to do with asking the right questions, setting up the right question prompts. And so even things like brainstorming, for example, or drawing upon connections. You're trying to get students to think at that high level by asking specific questions. And then another way is thinking about from a problem-solving context, which is also going to bring in your metacognitive components as well. And so getting students to work for a problem, doing the analysis, breaking it down into its subcomponents, and then getting students to sort of build that back up. And so I've just pulled out a couple of these techniques that we will, as I said, we will send around the slides, and there's this, and also would definitely recommend people taking a look at that report as well, because there was a lot of examples. I pulled up the ones I think will be most relevant, but there is a lot of stuff within that report as well. And again, this is sort of the mapping of very kind of concrete techniques to those activities. And so thinking about things like role play. And so in particular, people talk about the different thinking hats, which are often used for critical thinking. And then doing things like, again, kind of just picking up your examples, doing things like reverse engineering. And so getting students to start at the very end and work their way backwards. And then doing things like a risk or a SWOT method or SWOT analysis. And so getting students to weigh up those different options. And then another thing, which is because we know the impact of dual coding, and we know the impact of visuals on students' learning. Another thing linked to that, which is particularly effective for critical thinking, is using things like mind maps, but using them in a really intentional way. And so this, if you've been on a webinar before, I've definitely talked about argumentation view diagrams before. I'm a very big advocate of them. And so normally this is when you want students to evaluate an argument. And so you have like the pros and the cons, you have your argument in the middle, and then you get synthesis. This is an interesting example of something. So this particular argumentation view diagram I've shown is more of a scientific and kind of a method-based use of the argumentation view diagram, but sort of essentially using this and using this visual to guide people through those steps of thinking. And so hopefully this particular example is hopefully applicable, but if you wanted to tweak it and use it in a slightly different way, then you could do. A bonus study, I'm conscious I'm going to wrap up very soon, so we've got a bit of space for people's questions and comments. So this study had literally just been released. It popped up on my Google Scholar alert yesterday, and I thought this would be something else that potentially people might be interested to look at. And so this is the impact, again, thinking about those collaborative, cooperative, and kind of dialogic approaches. This is to the impact of think, pair, share methods on critical thinking. Spoiler, it does have an impact on critical thinking. And again, really what's underpinning it is those use of effective questions. So this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Obviously, a lot of it depends on your context and depends what you're doing. So hopefully I've given enough helpful information for you to think about what that might look like in your context, and really building up the pedagogical approaches, and then bridging it to the activities, and then to the specific techniques within it. And then I'm going to rattle through this quite quickly in about 3 minutes. And then we can open up the discussion, and we can bring up, also if we want to do that very final poll, we can do that. Okay, so this obviously slightly different context, thinking about it in a widening participation context, but thinking about the development of critical thinking. And so at the beginning, Steve spoke through what we call our program PI, and he talked about the Scholars Programme. And so this is all about giving students super curricular topics and giving them a university learning experience. And so they work with a researcher, they learn about a brand new topic, And then really a big thing we're trying to do through the teaching of that is to develop critical thinking skills. And you can see in some of the bubbles topics which we will cover in our courses. And this is just a bit of reference. I know at the beginning someone in the chat talked about the importance of evaluation. And so these are the intermediate outcomes, and critical thinking is one of them. And from an academic perspective, in terms of, we would anticipate that would improve school attainment, and then that would also impact progression to university. And then this is some of our data. So the students taking part in the Scholars Programme, they do a baseline and a final assignment. And so a complex piece of writing, so between 1,000 and 2,000 words, or a problem set if the PhD topic is linked to maths or science. And then we assess critical thinking through a rubric. And you can see that the critical thinking skills, which we know from the research are very perceived as very important, we've built into our rubric, so things like analysis, for example, and evaluation. And then this is an example of the improvements we see between the beginning and end of the programme. And interestingly, critical thinking is actually where we see those bigger shifts. And then this is just a resource that you might find interesting. So we recently been working on a broader project across the wider anticipation sector. And as part of that, trying to understand the intermediate outcomes which are linked to university access. And there's a section on critical thinking in there, which people might find interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna finish there, and we've got 7, is that right? Let's see, 7 minutes for questions. Cool. Yeah, should we? Yeah, we'll do the poll, and then that will also give people a moment to put some things in the chat as well. So yeah, we'll do the poll, give people a minute, and then that also might foster a few questions as well. Okay, so we're just going to take a quick look at the final poll, and then also do feel free to put things into the chat if you've got any reflections, comments, or questions. We've got 5 minutes to have a little bit of a chat there. Yeah, and really interesting to see on the poll that the importance of that dialogic approach, so group discussions and questions coming through. I think that also links to the fact that when we talk about teaching critical thinking, we can't be too prescriptive in the sense of, we are really talking about good questioning and really that open dialogue and discussion and opportunities for feedback. Okay, so I'm gonna pause there, and I'm gonna see what we have in the chat. Okay, so I'm gonna just respond to some of the comments coming through, but if anybody's got a question and they want to put their hand up directly, as I say this, is either that, will that be is that an option? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the question from Rachel to do with space affecting critical thinking. So this is quite a new area, and so we, as in like space practice is not a new area. There's loads of research in terms of knowledge. There's stuff which kind of preceded the Wise Heart papers. There were a couple of things done around the application of critical thinking, the application of knowledge. And again, it all comes back to your definition of critical thinking. And so there's a couple of things there which indicate if you're doing spaced practice and then you transfer to a similar subject in terms of the knowledge transfer, people are able to transfer that. There's obviously a broader conversation about whether you would class it more knowledge-based or critical thinking. But I think really the stuff with the Wise Heart papers is the stuff, it's the only stuff I know about that is really to do with that spacing and critical thinking. So there's definitely a lot more room for research in that area. And then picking up on the subject-specific point, I think a lot of it is hopefully the stuff I've gone through is applicable. Somebody's given the example of psychology. I think for psychology, the stuff around those learning strategies and the application of that, and especially we do know retrieval practice is effective. And so using retrieval practice to inform critical thinking and really placing those higher order questions is a really good thing to do. But yeah, there are going to be particular activities and things that will speak more or less to different subjects and different individuals, which is what I tried to give a little bit of breadth there. And I think, checking, I think that is everything. Yeah. Thank you everybody, for joining and sticking with us through some of the tech stuff. It's been a really lovely session to deliver. I'm going to hand back to the scenes to give the final word.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lauren. Hopefully you can all hear me now as well. And like I said, do apologize for some of the some of the tech issues. Sharing a room is actually pretty more difficult than anticipated. But really appreciate your time this afternoon and for you all joining us. And obviously, I'm sure if this was in person, there'd be a rapturous round of applause for Lauren. But we really appreciate Lauren giving up her time to kind of share research and insights from our work here at the Brilliant Club, but also right the way across kind of the educational spectrum as well. So yeah, really hope you found that useful and that there were some key takeaways from that. I'll be following up with a copy of the slides. I'll also be sharing a recording over the next couple of days once that's been rendered down, and I'll also be sharing a feedback form as well. We do really value feedback from our attendees, so any thoughts and queries that may have arisen from today, please do jot those down and let us know how we did. We love to hear feedback from these sessions. I'll also be sharing my contact details, so if you would like to explore partnership in more detail, or if you do have any follow-up questions for Lauren, we can pick those up on an individual basis. But that brings us nicely to 5. So thank you all very much for your time this afternoon, and do enjoy the rest of your evenings. Take care. Bye-bye.